Hello and welcome to another optional update, this time about the Vauxhall Astra. So the first thing I thought I'd mention is that some people, when they watch my videos, they comment that I spend a lot of time on, let's say, the first version of a car, and when it comes to the latter versions of the car, let's say it's a car that has 6 revisions, the 6th revision I just kind of rush through and I don't really talk about it very much. So partly this is because I'm talking about the first version of the car is basically the most important one. It's the conception of the vehicle, it's setting a standard for what's going to happen. It's also very successful, so it's really the start of really what's going to happen with the car. Another problem that I have though is that there's actually more information about the first versions of a particular car. So for example, the Vauxhall Astra, there's a lot of information online, thanks to people who've done research and looked into it, about the first and the second versions of the car. But there's really not very much information about the development processes of the 7th version or the 8th version. So you're stuck a little bit in the fact that I actually have less information. And part of that reason is because people obviously, like the websites that I go to, they've spent the time, they have the nostalgia for the car, they want to put the time in to find out what happened to their favourite car, and there's a nostalgia factor to that, which of course there isn't for newer cars. There's also the fact that some of these designers have retired and maybe you can talk to them like I've done with Steve Harper and Patrick Lecouemont. But of course with newer cars, these people haven't retired, they're still working, they've got busy jobs, they haven't got time to be talking to people about nostalgia-fueled dreams. So those are part of the reasons why I have that problem. So anyway, if you're wondering why I spent more time on the first versions rather than the latter versions, now you know. So another thing is, this video is consciously about the Vauxhall Astra, which isn't an original car. The Opel Kadett is the original car, and of course it's Opel doing all the work to design that, although I talk a little bit about Vauxhall and how they tried a restyling which was ultimately unsuccessful. But the reason I'm doing this is consciously a video about a rebranding versus a car that's the original car. And as I say, this is a conscious effort to talk about that, because there are many different cars around the world which are just rebrandings of other existing cars. Even in this video you see the Chevrolets, there's Saturns, there's Holdens, of versions of this Opel car, the Opel Kadett, which became the Opel Astra. So one day I may do a video just focusing on the Opel Kadett and the motivations around Opel in the 70s and 80s and 90s and beyond, to talk about exactly what they were looking at. But I figured this would be a good video to talk about essentially the British side of it. It also helps that most people who watch my videos are British, and of course they will feel most closely associated with the Vauxhall brand. So in 1975, talking about Vauxhall and the end of Vauxhall's design, in 1975, I think around then, essentially the whole Vauxhall design department was cut. Vauxhall were producing interesting cars, but they had a really bad reputation from the 1950s and 60s as being just complete rot boxes. But another problem that Vauxhall as a car company had in the 1970s was Opel was just so much better. The Opel Kadett, the T-car platform of the early 70s, which turned out to be the Vauxhall Chevette, that was the car that GM looked at and said, that's really a well put together car. Opel are really doing good things. We really need that because there's been this oil crisis and suddenly we need small cars in America. And so Opel's light gets to shine because they get to import their car into America, and American Detroit gets to see, wow, Opel's really firing on all cylinders. At the same time, you've got Vauxhall as a car company producing cars that aren't selling so well, and there's also concerns about reliability, of course. And so Vauxhall stars on the wane in the 70s, and at the same time, GM and Chrysler, of course, are looking towards Ford's European model about how to produce cars. Ford had an operation in Britain, they had an operation in Germany that again were producing different cars. And in the mid-60s, they make a conscious effort to say, we won't make cars which overlap Ford Britain and Ford Germany's lineup. So we're going to merge our models. Initially, they had problems because, of course, Britain was using the imperial system and Germany was using the metric system, but these problems had to be solved, and Ford solved them very well. They had Germany making some models, had Britain making other models, and eventually they would essentially merge the operations again, but they would do a very good job doing it, and GM and Chrysler took notice. And so with the Vauxhall design department and an Opel design department, and Opel doing really well, it was a matter of time before Vauxhall was essentially going to get the chop. And so that just left the Vauxhall styling department. And again, Ford was showing that you didn't really need to have separate styling departments for different countries around Europe. You could just sell one car in Britain, you can sell one car in Germany, one car in France, and it would look the same, and people would just be very happy to accept it, because why wouldn't they? I mean, it's essentially, it's the same car. But I do feel that General Motors was maybe a bit timid in getting rid of the Vauxhall name. Yes, Vauxhall had an historic name that went back decades. Yes, it was very British. And yes, people don't like the fact that Marathon was renamed Snickers just to try and sort of consolidate everything into a one European whole. But we were moving more European in the 1970s, and people can take the fact that you rename things, yes, as a small-term pain for long-term gain, because you then get to consolidate all of your marketing and sales message across all of Europe. For example, European football matches, of course, are watched all over Europe, and the advertising hoardings are seen by people, again, all over Europe. Well, it would make sense for General Motors to be able to put Opel branded advertising up there rather than having to worry about maybe putting Vauxhall branding up and Opel branding. So it saves on marketing budget. But even in 2005, Vauxhall and Opel had different letters for their sporty models. Vauxhall used VXR, and presumably for Vauxhall Racing. And then on the continent, they used OPC for Opels. One thing that struck me while making the video, and I try and talk about this a little bit, but I'm not sure I really get the message across properly, is that Opel, when they designed the Kadett, they designed the car to be just good enough. The reason why you don't see many of these 80s versions of the Opel Kadett and the Vauxhall Astra on the road now is because, of course, they've all rotted and the mechanicals have gone. But at the end of the day, Opel were trying to make a car that, as I say, was just good enough. It was easy to maintain, so it's great for fleet managers. It was great for the first 10 years of its life, but it wasn't designed to be a car that lasted for 30 or 40 years, and people weren't buying it for that. If you wanted to buy a new Opel Kadett or a new Vauxhall Astra, you weren't thinking, oh, I'm going to keep this car for 30, 40 years. And Vauxhall and Opel were very smart in just making a car that was essentially, as I say, just good enough, because that makes it cheaper to produce, and which means the cost comes down for the consumer and they can buy a cheaper car and they can get the car that they want. And as I've pointed out, Opel spent the time making the mechanicals easy to repair, which again brought down the total cost of ownership, making the entire cost for the car cheaper, which was music to both consumers and fleet managers' ears. They weren't thinking about the longevity of the car. So in my mind, Opel was right in making a car that was just good enough. Just like in the 13th century, they made churches that were way over-engineered because they didn't understand all the force load calculations and things like that that went into making a building. And as we did, and particularly as we created more sophisticated ways of being able to work that out using computers, you now find you have bridges and buildings that are just strong enough to stand up, no more, no less. And that's so that they can use the minimum amount of material, they can be as cheap as possible, but they don't need to be any stronger because they're never going to fall down if they're maintained the way that they should. So there's so much in this video. It was a 30-minute video, but it's covering such a vast topic that don't be offended if your bit didn't get in. There were bits that I realized that I also missed when I was actually doing the video and doing all the extra photos and videos that I put on top of the video. One thing that I missed, that I'm sure there's many others I missed, but one thing that I noticed that I missed was in the 1980s. Was it Teo? I'm trying to get the right brand. Daewoo is how you would say it in England, but I think people in Korea say Teo. There was a car called the Teo Le Mans, which was essentially a Mark II Vauxhall Astra, a mid-1980s Opel Kadett. And that got imported into the US as the Pontiac Le Mans, which I think in 1986, which went on for a few years. So again, there was lots of different versions, and lots of Opel took this, or General Motors took this car all around the world and sold it in many different ways, and it's hard to keep up. So one thing I also thought, which I mentioned in the video, that I thought Vauxhall and Opel really missed a trick on, was hybrid cars. In my Toyota Prius video, I talk a lot about hybrids, and there was a real rush to hybrid technology in the early 2000s as people saw that essentially you can get another 10 miles per gallon for free, essentially with a hybrid drivetrain, which was not that much more expensive than a regular drivetrain. So it seemed to me that General Motors really missed a beat. They were too slow in bringing hybrid drivetrains to their range of cars, and that can be seen in the Vauxhall Astra, which up until 2021 hasn't had a hybrid drivetrain. They've tried to improve their engines and they've tried to make them more efficient, and that's great, but when essentially, particularly in Europe, there's so many cars nowadays that they've just changed to having hybrid or plug-in hybrid drivetrains because they're so much more efficient. It's taken the Vauxhall Astra way too long to get to that point. One last thing I thought I'd mention is that with OnStar, the reason why I talk about OnStar is because I used to work for Microsoft, and that the department I was in created the competitor to OnStar, the Ford Sync system. And so we were spending a lot of time paying a lot of close attention to General Motors OnStar system in the late 90s and the work that they were doing. And it looks like, rather than being this sort of concierge feature, they've sort of given up on that whole concierge thing, because people can essentially just dial 999 or 911 or whatever they want to call and get to emergency services, and no one's really willing to pay for that technology. And so it seems what they were trying to pitch in the last few years, the 2015 version of the Vauxhall Astra, was to try and make it into some sort of 4G data sharing service for the car. But again, you're sort of fighting a losing battle there, because if you've got a cell phone, a lot of cell phones nowadays you can just data share from those anyway, or you can just most people tend to have a phone anyway which has a data plan on it, and kids have a data plan in the back seat. So again, I think they were fighting a bit of a losing battle with that one. Then of course, when Vauxhall and Opel got sold to Stellantis, then of course, you know, that they had to get rid of the OnStar service anyway, and it probably wasn't doing very well, so they just dropped the whole thing. Anyway, that's the optional extra for the Vauxhall Astra. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate you watching these videos, and I hope you get a bit more out of these extra videos. So I'll see you in the next video.